focused on those attempts to reach a deal ahead of next week's summit of EU leaders in Brussels. The post-mortem for just what went wrong yesterday, when many had predicted a breakthrough on the first part of the negotiations, including the tricky question of what to do about the Irish border, is in full swing. Blame has been spread widely to include everyone, it seems, the British government, the DUP, the Irish government and the EU for leaking the details and talking up the chances of a deal in the first place. Earlier this morning, the Chancellor Philip Hammond was asked what exactly had happened.
Well, look, we've been involved in a very complex negotiation that's been going on for some time. We have made a lot of progress over the last weeks. We've made tremendous steps forward. We are very close, but we're not there yet. As the Prime Minister said yesterday, we will have to do some further consultations, some further discussion today, and she expects to come back to Brussels later in the week. And in the meantime, we've got work to do.
Philip Hammond there. Well, we're joined here by someone who's been watching all of this more closely than is probably good for her health. It's the BBC's Laura Kunsberg. Welcome back from Brussels.
Thank you.
You've only just arrived, really, haven't you? What went wrong?
Well, there is a wide variety of interpretations in terms of what actually went wrong. In terms of the choreography, what went wrong is clearly the DUP, who Theresa May needs to get her Brexit legislation through the Commons, she relies on them, had not been consulted enough in order to be completely happy with the draft agreement that was changed, tweaked, worked on furiously over the weekend. So when Theresa May was sitting in her meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker, pictured happily there behind you, at that point, over in Belfast, Arlene Foster and her colleagues in the DUP came waltzing down the stairs at the Stormont Assembly and said basically they weren't happy with it, at which point Theresa May had to leave her meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker to have a private one-on-one phone call with Arlene Foster, during the course of which I understand Ms Foster basically said, we can't put up with this. Theresa May had to go back into the meeting and tell Jean-Claude Juncker that in terms of yesterday at least, it was off. Now, how we got to that point, there are lots of different versions of events, and I'm sure we can talk about those in a moment.
Right. I mean, and we'll talk about the substance of why they're not happy with it in just a moment. But first of all, it is quite extraordinary that Theresa May had to come out of that meeting to talk to the DUP, as you say, who prop up Theresa May in this instance. Whose fault was that the DUP had not been properly consulted?
Well, fingers are being pointed in different directions. So it's been suggested to me that the newish Chief Whip had assured the Prime Minister that the DUP was squared off, and that proved not to be the case. It's also been put to me that actually this is all the fault of officials in Number 10, Ollie Robbins, who has not got the political nous to understand that this was not going to be politically acceptable. One does then wonder what the Prime Minister herself was making of it and why she thought it might be political acceptable. And her critics would suggest that actually it's because she's too much of a manager and a technocrat, not in fact somebody with real political nous at her fingertips. Of course, there are also fingers being pointed at the European Union for pushing Ireland too hard, and Ireland pushing the UK too hard towards a solution where they were making all of these demands on having these kinds of assurances in black and white that were never going to be acceptable to their cousins across the Irish border in the north. In terms of who's officially to blame, well, of course, no one, because the talks go on, there's a bit more work to do, and that'll all be fine by Friday.
Let's talk about the substance of why the DUP ended up being so unhappy, because this is about something called regulatory alignment.
Great phrase,
it is a great phrase, just trips off the tongue and means probably very little to a lot of us. But really it means Northern Ireland being treated the same as the rest of the UK, and they don't want to be treated any differently, except there are things that they do in common with Ireland.
That's right.
Issues that have been agreed in the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes.
So what is it that they were so unhappy about?
Well, as you suggest, it's a principle for the DUP. They do not want Brexit to mean that Northern Ireland in any way looks less British than the rest of the United Kingdom. That's their reason for being. They're a unionist party. However, as you say, there are issues on which they already have lots of cooperation with the Irish government, water, animal welfare, things like that. There's already a lot of cooperation there. What they were unhappy about yesterday was the extent to which this proposed deal implied, really, that in future Northern Ireland would be more closely tied to the EU in some areas than it would be potentially to the UK. So as the UK strikes out on its own, maybe changing the rules and regulations, that's the point of Brexit after all, Northern Ireland wouldn't be able to do that, and therefore the paths of the two parts of the United Kingdom would be splitting. But why this is so sort of neuralgic, why this is so toxic, is because this is really, in some ways, a proxy for the debate that's happening inside the Tory party. What kind of Brexit are we going to end up with? Are we going to end up with the kind of vision that Philip Hammond would like to see, where to make things easy and stable for business, basically we stick pretty closely to the European Union, we mirror what's happening? Or are we going to end up with the kind of Brexit where we do really strike out on our own? We are much more able to make changes as we see fit. So it's a principle for the unionists, but it's also so difficult here at Westminster because it presses on the bruise of the fight that's actually been going on in the Tory party for months now. And it's been suggested to me this morning that it may get to the point where there's pressure on her to walk. One senior Tory party said to me, if the EU is not prepared to bury this for now, to postpone the Irish issue until the second phase, Theresa May ought to walk out from the talks.
Vince Cable, negotiations like these, despite what some people said, were always going to be complicated. You've got to get so many people on side. But isn't this just part and parcel of what happens? And actually, a deal is still possible before Christmas.
Well, we're not talking about a final deal.
No, I mean a deal to move on to the next stage.
Moving from the foothills to the real mountains. But actually, this is a mess on several levels. I mean, you've got a party that accounts for 1% of the British public, which doesn't even represent the majority in Northern Ireland, effectively holding the government to ransom. And I think all the points that Laura's just made, I mean, there is a lot of just sheer incompetence. And I think the one way in which British public mood is changing, I mean, their overall assessment of Brexit hasn't changed, but the one way in which public mood is changing is to feel that the government is handling this very, very badly.
Right, but they're not changing their mind on Brexit, are they?
Not yet, but we haven't yet seen what the outcome is. The one thing that is very striking, and the Survation poll in the Mail on Sunday made this very clear, is we now have a significant margin, about 16%, of those people who think that there ought to be a referendum on the final deal. That was not the case before. We put that case in June in the election, didn't win that argument.
No, you don't seem to have improved your position in the polls as a result.
It is now moving strongly in that direction.
Can I just come back to this issue, though, of other parts of the party, of the Tory party, that actually have jumped to some extent on the bandwagon? You've got Ruth Davidson, very influential, obviously, in her role in Scotland, saying, well, why don't we just do the same for the whole of the UK in terms of aligning ourselves more closely to the EU? And, of course, Nicola Sturgeon saying something similar. We've had on the Labour side Sadiq Khan. Now, you can see there could be more pressure and an attempt to have what we used to call a soft Brexit.
That's right. And, you know, the one solution, one former minister in government was saying to me yesterday, not one of the usual suspects, Remainers, was saying to me yesterday, technically, it would be really easy to fix all of this. You just say, fine, we stay in the customs union. The difficulty for Theresa May is she's ruled that out, and maybe half, maybe even 2/3 of the 1922 of the Tory backbenchers just wouldn't accept that. So there is there potentially a solution, but that would, of course, have consequences for how we could strike free trade agreements. That would undermine potentially a lot of the possible opportunities that come after we leave the European Union. So it is fiendishly difficult, but in a sense, you're seeing Theresa May's red lines that seemed sort of so limited, and so many of them have already faded to pink, in fact, but her kind of political box that she has built herself means that rather than being able to sort of make bold offers, she's very much hemmed in. But I think also someone was sort of pulling their hair out this morning saying the thing is she's got to understand she's not going to be able to please everybody.
Yes. So the question is, who is she prepared to let go?
Make most cross.
Will there be a deal?
Well, look, it's still possible. I mean, this is what I was going to say. It is still the case that the fundamental here is that all sides want there to be a deal. It is also the case that while it would be very politically inconvenient and not what Number 10 wants, December isn't the last chance. OK, it is feasible that this could go until March. It's not what the EU wants. It's not what the British government wants. But some people think, well, why not? What is the rush? Because part of the problem here is the time pressure. Now, for others, CBI, business groups would be appalled by that because they're worried about investment decisions being delayed. But it certainly is possible. And if suddenly the DUP come back on board by the end of the week, the politics will have a completely different complexion yet again.
Yes, well, we look forward to that. Thank you very much, Laura. Let's pause now briefly for our daily quiz. The question for today is, which party leader has taken part in a charity Christmas song singing the Mariah Carey classic, All I Want for Christmas? Is it A, my guest of the day, Vince Cable, B, the SNP's Nicola Sturgeon, C, the DUP's Arlene Foster, or D, UKIP's Henry Bolton? And at the end of the show, Vince will hopefully give us the correct answer, or maybe sing along too.
I
Now,
know. Can I tell you?
No, not until the end of the show. You can come back then. Let's pick up now where we left off very briefly on Brexit. We knew there would be plenty of shuttle diplomacy needed during these negotiations with the EU, and Theresa May has plenty more people to try and get on side in the coming weeks. This morning she held a meeting of the Cabinet where she will have had to explain why a deal hasn't been agreed. Convention is that the Prime Minister addresses Parliament after any significant EU meeting. She won't be speaking to MPs today, but there will be an urgent question on the subject in the Commons, which Brexit Secretary David Davis will respond to. Theresa May needs to ease unionist concerns that Northern Ireland could have a separate status within the UK under a future deal. But it's unclear whether there will be any talks with DUP leader Arlene Foster today. She could then skip Prime Minister's questions to head back to Brussels as early as tomorrow to resume talks with European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. The Prime Minister is under pressure to get an agreement on EU divorce issues before European leaders meet next Thursday to decide if enough progress has been made to start talks on post-Brexit trade. And, of course, that doesn't just include the tricky question of the Irish border, but also whether the European Court of Justice will have jurisdiction over EU citizens in the UK after Brexit, and for how long. Both sides say they're optimistic a deal can still be reached, but it has to be agreed by the EU, including Ireland, the Democratic Unionist Party's 10 MPs, who Theresa May relies on for her majority, and the rest of the Conservative Party. And to help us make sense of why yesterday's talks failed to break the impasse on the status of the Irish border, I'm joined now by Ali Renison, Head of Trade and Brexit Policy at the Institute of Directors. Ali, thank you for joining us here at the Daily Politics. We talked briefly just a moment ago about regulatory divergence and continued regulatory alignment. What's the difference?
I think the tendency is to look at this, that this is a sort of discussion about semantics, although if you were to really sort of peel back some of the layers, when you talk about avoiding divergence, I think that allows you, sort of leads you down the path of concluding that this would be ensuring that the UK is more in step with EU rules governing the single market, i.e. more along the lines of Norway, and regulatory alignment allows a bit more flexibility. Some might call it room for fudge or interpretation, but would obviously depend on a very unprecedented level of regulatory cooperation between the UK, the EU, Ireland, and those parties involved.
Right. So do you think this is an attempt to fudge it by changing the language and the semantics of the text?
I think it was always a question about how much you were going to get conclusively resolved relating to the Irish border in phase one. You know, the concern, I think, from businesses now, and while those of us who deal in policy are obviously following day by day, hour by hour what's going on, I think most businesses are really looking at this and saying, as long as we get over the line next week, that's all that matters. Because, and I think it's important for all parties, including the Irish government, to remember that if we don't get sufficient progress next week, I think the noise for walking off without a deal becomes very, very loud indeed. So that's the most important thing that people are looking at. And they will, I'm actually pretty optimistic when I hear people like Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk say that they feel confident about getting a deal, because in the past, when they haven't felt confident, they've said that.
Right. Was it too optimistic to expect an agreement yesterday?
Well, we don't know. We're not privy to all the different ins and outs of the conversations and the various texts that were being drafted. It's not clear to what extent all parties involved that would have a say were being consulted in advance, obviously. So that's a question I think we saw people in the Commission saying today that the show now is in London. So that is obviously reflective of the fact that there needs to be some discussion about, you know, where is it that the UK wants to head generally. And I think for better or for worse, what the last 24 to 48 hours have shown is that that discussion about what does the UK want as a whole in terms of regulatory relationship with the EU is suddenly being brought forward.
I mean, how much detail, as you said, can be done at this stage? Or are we expecting the individual parties, whether it's the Irish government or the DUP or the Conservative Party, to take on trust the broad outline at this stage before you can move on?
Well, you often hear when you're in Brussels discussion about the importance of the UK government conveying that trust and goodwill, and that has happened in the past through the speeches that Theresa May, the Prime Minister, has made in Florence. You saw the sort of the money issue move after that. So I think what the Irish government is probably looking for is a roadmap, they say, to sort of showing that no matter what happens, the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, the North-South cooperation that exists currently will be protected. And as long as there is sort of enough trust to show that that is what the UK intends to do, then perhaps we can leave a lot of the practical discussions for phase 2, because that's really where it feels at the moment that we're just dancing around all these issues that cannot really be separated from discussions about future arrangements overall.
Ali Renison, thank you very much. Well, we're joined here by the Conservative MP Kwasi Kwarteng. He's also an aide to Chancellor Philip Hammond for Labour, the shadow Brexit spokesperson Jenny Chapman, and of course Vince Cable is our guest of the day as leader of the Liberal Democrats. Kwasi Kwarteng, should the DUP have been properly consulted and informed about the deal the Prime Minister was about to sign up to yesterday?
Well, I think that the whole point of a negotiation and the Prime Minister's conversation was that it was only really at the end of that process that they came up with a formula of words. And of course, you can't inform people of the formula of words you're going to come up with before you've actually started the negotiation. I think that there was a misunderstanding. I understand from various blogs that one journalist from Ireland made a tweet about what the nature of the deal was, and the DUP essentially reacted to that. But it's clear to me that we can definitely get a deal. As the Chancellor said this morning, he's very confident of the deal. And also, as your interlocutor said just now, both Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker are very optimistic about getting a deal. And I think that's something that we can celebrate.
But Kwasi Kwarteng, Theresa May was in the meeting with Jean-Claude Juncker, having lunch with him.
That's right.
And the DUP, Sammy Wilson, has said any attempt to placate Dublin and the EU could mean a withdrawal of DUP support for the government. Why didn't they know what was being agreed?
Because, as far as I understand, there was a leak from the lunch or whatever it was, the statement that they were going to make, which had come out, and they reacted in the way that they did.
But should there have been exchange of papers? I mean, your colleague Owen Paterson has said it's extraordinary that there wasn't an exchange of official papers between the DUP and the government.
I don't see it in the way that Owen does at all.
Well, but that's why they're not supporting it. So they've scuppered this agreement.
Before we get very excited about this, I'm very confident that a deal will be made, and I'm also very confident that the DUP will be able to agree to the terms of any future deal that we have.
What gives you that confidence? What's going to change then? What's the government going to do to get the DUP on board?
I think the DUP have said, and the government has said, that they want Northern Ireland to be treated as a whole with the rest of the UK. And that's something that the DUP and the Conservative Party is committed to. It's a Conservative and Unionist party for point of information.
Right, so was it a mistake to talk about regulatory alignment then between Ireland and Northern Ireland?
I think that regulatory alignment wouldn't be a deal breaker for me. The DUP clearly had an issue with that, and we're going to have to come up with a more specific formula of words to please them. I completely understand that. That's how negotiation and diplomacy is conducted.
But it's not just a form of words, is it? There's going to have to be a decision by the government as to whether they are going to align Northern Ireland with the EU more closely, which the DUP has said no to. And if they don't do that, then the Irish government isn't going to agree, because they thought yesterday we're going to have regulatory equivalence between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
But equivalence isn't the same as alignment. I don't want to get into a semantic debate. I mean, clearly regulatory alignment is different from regulatory equivalence, and we can do a deal based on the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland and the rest of the EU. I think that's eminently achievable.
Right. Do you think a deal is possible? It seems that actually this can be squared, and it was about people leaking details too soon yesterday.
I think it's shocking
what
happened yesterday. What happened yesterday was embarrassing for the country. It is extraordinary that the Prime Minister didn't keep the DUP informed. I spoke to the DUP last night and again this morning informally, and they're very cross that they felt that they weren't respected and included and kept informed, and they felt that the Conservative Party hadn't really got to know them. But I think they feel they do now, and the Prime Minister needs to take this a very, very different approach. She seems to have this attitude on many occasions, actually, where she wants to do deals privately, but she falls short on the aspects of it which are around communication and in bringing people with her. And that's a very important quality when you're talking about this kind of negotiation. Right,
well, we'll come on to the substance in a moment, but so it was mishandled, completely mishandled, and the DUP are very cross.
I actually think what you said in the question to the Labour representative was right. I think it was a question of a tweet. It was a question of leaked statements which were slightly misinterpreted.
So we lose a deal on the back of a tweet, Kwasi? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that, but you
are
understand.
saying that.
But you understand.
Well, the practical result has been is the deal hasn't been done.
No, Jenny will understand that we live in a social media age where things are tweeted all the time.
Well, the Prime Minister ought to understand that too.
And people react all the time to that.
Did the number 10 operation fail to come up to the standards here?
We were very close to a deal. I think a deal is still eminently achievable and is far more likely than not. And I think we will have made significant progress because all these people, Vince and Jenny, were saying that it was never going to happen. They were doomsayers right from the start.
No.
They never thought we would get a deal.
No,
and I think it's a real credit to the government that we're going to achieve a deal in the time that
Right, well, let me answer that. Isn't that what you did say, that this is a mess?
Well, you don't even believe in Brexit. You want to stay in the EU.
Hang on, let Vince answer.
We haven't got a deal yet. But on the two big areas where the government claims it has got an agreement, which are on the rights of citizens on the money, basically it's happened because the British government has signed up to what the European Union asked for a year ago. I mean, this is... they knew exactly what was coming down the track. And on the Irish question, Jenny's right. I mean, it was terribly incompetent. But underneath the incompetence, there is a fundamental problem of difference. You either have a hard border or you don't. This isn't a question of nuance and language. You may well get some agreement on regulatory convergence or divergence, which is about the single market. But the basic issue of freedom of movement across the frontier, but through trade, which is a customs union issue, has not been resolved. It hasn't even been confronted yet.
Yeah,
These are massive problems.
But you will know that it wasn't part of the first phase of the discussion. You said that
so
yourself earlier.
You
said that earlier yourself. In this
right, well, let's clear up Labour's position here, because do you agree, Jenny Chapman, with Ruth Davidson, who says if regulatory alignment in a number of specific areas is the requirement for a frictionless border, then the Prime Minister should conclude this must be on a UK-wide basis. Should we stay in the customs union?
I completely agree with Ruth on saying we need to deal with this on a UK-wide basis. We cannot have separate deals for bits of the United Kingdom.
Right.
So yes on that.
So should we stay in the customs union?
We would not have ruled out membership of the customs union in the way that the Prime Minister has, and I am sure she now regrets that.
Right.
Because she has boxed herself in, and by taking that off the table, which is something that the Labour Party would not have done, and we would have kept the customs union not just on the table, but we would have wanted it for the transition period as well.
So what would your deal look like? What would your deal look like at this stage, though, Jenny Chapman, if you don't even know whether you would have been in or out of the customs union?
We would keep it on the table.
Yeah, but how could you do an agreement then?
Because if she'd...
What would you have agreed yesterday?
Because yesterday, we don't need to have the full details agreed. What we need
is... You do need to know if you want to be in the customs union or you want to be outside it.
What she could have said is we are not ruling out membership of the customs union.
Sorry, I don't understand. I mean, Vince Cable's position is clear. You want to stay in the customs union and in the single market. So that is a clear position. You may not like it or not. And the Conservatives here under Kwasi Kwarteng are saying we must be outside the customs union, we must be outside the single market. Again, you may not agree with it. And Labour's position is we're not sure.
No, Labour's position is that we would keep it on the table and we would negotiate from that position. This is a negotiation. This is not a situation where Theresa May can turn up in Brussels and say, this is what I want, this is what I must have.
But you have criticised the government because you've said that we do need to know what the government actually wants, and they've said what they want.
What she needs to do is to go to Brussels and say we are not ruling out the customs union, which could be the solution to not just the future of jobs and trade for the whole of the UK, but solves this absolutely critical issue of the Irish border. And people who are saying, like Kwasi, that we want to be out of the customs union cannot answer how you solve the Irish border.
Right.
They're prepared
it's true,
to sacrifice
though, isn't it? That is the solution. And actually, what would you say if Theresa May, in the end, agrees that that is the only way to solve this problem, is to say we are going to stay in some sort of customs union in order to have that frictionless border?
I think you put it very well. I think Vince's position is very clear.
Answer my question.
My position is clear. I think we've got to come out of the customs union and out of the single market.
So you're not prepared to negotiate on that at all?
The issue about the customs union is that if we stay in the customs union, we will not be able to strike bilateral deals with any other country. And that's very, very important. That's a very important part of Britain's sovereignty and a part of our opportunities. The Labour position is as clear as mud, frankly, on all of these issues. I respect Vince's position because he has a clarity. He thinks we should never have left and we should stay in the EU forever and a day, as far as I can work out. But what I am saying is that we're going to leave, and we're going to leave both.
What's your view of Labour's position? Is that a more nuanced position? Would that have worked in these negotiations, saying we won't rule out staying in the customs union?
Well, I was disappointed by the lack of clarity, as you obviously were. But the point is, we need to know what the end point is. I mean, if you go into a negotiation, is the objective to stay in or go out? And I think we're reasonably clear where we need to be. But I think unless the Labour Party make it absolutely clear that at the end of the transition, are you going to be in the single market and the customs union or not? That question has to be answered.
And that is what we would be negotiating. But our starting point would be
You
very,
don't know
very
what you
different.
want.
Well, we want a solution that solves the Irish border and that protects jobs and the economy in the whole of the UK.
But doesn't actually amount to Brexit.
We don't want a solution that treats different parts of the UK differently. Now, with the best will in the world, it's not the Labour Party who are negotiating in Brussels.
But does that mean you shouldn't have a clear position?
Well, we do have a clear position that takes us through this negotiation phase and through transition, which most people seem to estimate would be about 2 years. Now, that's not bad in terms of clarity from a party that isn't actually in the negotiations, and we would have handled yesterday a hell of a lot better than we saw from the Tory party.
But as Vince
All right,
said,
let me just ask Kwasi Kwarteng
Sure.
on the European Court of Justice.
Yeah.
Do you want to see an end to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice on EU citizens' rights in the UK after Brexit?
I would like to see an end to the overall jurisdiction of the ECJ. That was
When?
one of the things. Well, this is what we're negotiating. I suspect at the end of the transition period in 21, or I don't see it in 2019 because I think we are going to have a transition period. But certainly by the end of this Parliament, we should be out of their jurisdiction, and that's very clear. I think part of the whole debate about Brexit.
Right. I can just tell you that I think we've heard that Theresa May is going to be speaking to both Arlene Foster, the head of the DUP, and Michelle O'Neill for Sinn Féin later on today, obviously to try and get further agreement. Beyond transition, would you accept any jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice on EU citizens' rights?
No, I want full British sovereignty. I want full sovereignty of the United Kingdom. And I think we've got perfectly good human rights record. We've got a very good judicial system that's respected all around the world. And I think the rights of the EU citizen here will be confirmed by our own courts.
Right,
But
and
what
isn't that
about
possible?
Well, it's fine as far as it goes, but we're not just talking about EU citizens here, are we? We're talking about British citizens on the continent. And where do they go? Where do they get redress? Should they have an issue? We're saying, if you take Kwasi's position, that the ECJ would not have access to the ECJ to resolve anything. And that, it just seems to be a red line that was put there for ideological reasons by the Prime Minister to keep people like Kwasi on side early on in the process.
To do that to keep me
and
on
I
side.
suspect she probably wishes that she hadn't been quite so emphatic about that.
All right.
as we
If there
get
is
to this
no
point.
deal, if there is no agreement, I shouldn't use the word deal,
Sure.
if there's no agreement at this stage before moving on to phase 2 by December, should the Prime Minister walk away?
I think that we've always, in any negotiation, should be prepared to walk away. That's the whole point. I mean, that was one of the reasons why David Cameron got into the muddle that he did, because it was clear to his interlocutors that he wasn't prepared to walk away. I actually think that the chances of deal are very high.
You've said that.
And I also think that if it doesn't come to fruition this month, we've got till March.
Right,
Obviously,
so you
that's
are
not
saying
ideal.
you should wait
That's
until
not
March, you wouldn't
ideal.
walk away.
Ultimately, you should always have the ability to walk away from any negotiation. That's the whole point of a negotiation. I do think that we're so close that we should maybe give it a little bit more time in order to get a deal.
Right. Just before I let you go, should the DUP be calling the shots in the way they do?
I don't think they're particularly calling the shots. They have 10 MPs. We know that we rely on them for a parliamentary majority, but it's very much the Prime Minister and the Conservative government. There are no government ministers in the DUP that are driving this.
But they don't represent the